All right. So again, thank you for the invitation. This is a topic that is quite dear to me in recent years. My research for some time has been focused on technology ethics, particularly for data science and AI. And as I've been delving into these topics, I have certainly seen in recent years a large number of ethical, let's say, controversies and scandals. And often when these things are talked about in the media, we hear, well, the problem is just that those computer scientists are so unethical. And sometimes what is pointed to are issues in computer science education. And so that is one of the reasons why I started delving into this area. So as just a kind of taste of some of these things that have come up here, as I mentioned, I particularly look at data ethics, and in particular research ethics for data science and use of public data and that kind of thing. And so a number of things that have come up in recent years have included, for example, the use of public data such as social media data, data from online dating sites, YouTube, etc., to train AI models. Some other things that have come up quite recently have been a number of issues around facial recognition, including bias and racism and concerns about how these things might be used. And a recent example that I have been quite interested in was Zoombombing, which I imagine most of you have heard of, as Zoom became this hugely popular platform once so much of our interaction moved online. And this has been a problem in schools, town hall meetings, community meetings. In my department, there was a really terrible Zoom bombing in one of our classes. And the reason that this actually is a relevant example for the kinds of things that I'm talking about today is because when this happened and when Zoom started to be criticized for some of their default privacy settings and the ways that some of their privacy protocols worked, the CEO of Zoom spoke to the New York Times and said, we never thought about that. The risks, the misuse, we never thought about that. This isn't something that we designed for. And I and my students have been thinking about this as a problem. Again, the media sort of, the problem is that those computer scientists are so unethical. They're just not thinking about this stuff enough. So you might be familiar with the concept of technical debt, which is the idea that, we know there's going to be bugs in the software that we're creating. Like, we know there's going to be something, but we don't know what the bugs are going to be. And, we got to get it out. Like, we've got a release date. We got to move fast and break things. Like, let's get this thing out. And then once we see what breaks, we can fix the bugs. So the idea of technical debt is that it's this implied future cost of bug fixes, because we want to get it out fast, and things that would take longer would be harder to do. So you can imagine a corollary to this that involves the ethical and social costs of technology. So the idea of ethical debt is this implied cost of not considering the social and ethical implications of harms now, assuming that you can fix them once you know what they are. So like, I'm creating this new social platform, and I'm sure it's going to impact society in some way if it's successful. There might even be some ethical issues with it, but I don't know what they're going to be. I'm no fortune teller. I can't tell you that. And so we're going to put it out in the world. And then once we see what these bugs are, we'll try to fix them. And the problem with this is that, unlike, the form doesn't work when you click on the button, once it's out there and once in order to know what the harms are, the harm has to be done. And you can't undo it. Someone is harmed before you know that this has happened. And this has been a big conversation in computer science circles in recent years, particularly in the research community, around this idea of unintended or negative consequences of our work. So, for example, if we discover through our research that private traits and attributes are very predictable from digital records of human behavior, like Facebook likes, we might even notice and put in our paper that there are considerable negative implications of this research. Here are some horrible ways in which this could be used. And in this case, this particular research potentially inspired one of the biggest tech ethics scandals of the past couple of years, which was Cambridge Analytica, in which models created off of personality traits as predicted by Facebook like were used to attempt to manipulate voters in the US presidential election. And this was, of course, a huge, huge scandal all over the world. And at the time when this happened, a former Google engineer wrote an op-ed, Computer Science Faces an Ethics Crisis, and the Cambridge Analytica scandal proves it. When I read this, there was a particular part of this op-ed that really resonated with me, and it was this line: software engineers continue to treat safety and ethics as specialties rather than the foundation of all design. And when I read that, it really just kind of pinged something in my head, and I realized, oh, yeah, this is a problem that I've been thinking about for a while in terms of computer science education. And at the time I wrote this response that this tech ethics crisis, as it had been articulated here, says something about the state of computer science education, which is that we often teach ethics as if it is a specialty rather than the foundation of all design. And my sort of pithy tagline here was that if you work in tech and you're not thinking about ethics, you're bad at your job. And another metaphor that I was thinking about at this time and is in this op-ed is that, you know, on a construction site, there is someone whose job it is to be the safety engineer. Like, that is a specialty, it is something you are trained to do, and you are the person who, you know, makes sure that things are that things are safe and, you know, knows how to make things safer. But that doesn't mean that the person who's putting up the drywall sees a live wire on the ground and is like, well, maybe that's something bad, I'm not sure, but it's the safety engineer's job to think about that, and they walk on by. So the idea isn't that every computer scientist or every person who works in tech has to be an expert on ethics, but you do have to know enough to know that there's a problem, to be able to spot the problems, to care about the problems, and to know when you need to get help from experts when you need it. But the most common model in the US for how ethics is incorporated into CS education is for it to be taught in a standalone class, often at the end of a computer science degree. So in the United States, there is a requirement for accreditation that there is some vaguely stated ethics, social responsibility, professionalization as part of a computer science degree. But how this is done is very vague. Sometimes it's quite small. And again, you know, the most common model is a standalone class, as opposed to it being part of the technical process of computing. So a couple of years ago, along with some collaborators as part of a broader project, oh, skipped a slide. This is my hill to die on. My soapbox for computer science education is that ethics should not be a specialization. So we analyzed the syllabi and course descriptions from a set of AI machine learning and data science classes at US universities. I don't expect you to find any meaning in this chart. Here's the takeaway. We were looking for any mention of anything that very generously could be described as related to ethics. One line about differential privacy would have counted, for example. And what we found was that only 12% of technical courses included any mention of concepts like ethics or privacy. And this is AI, data science, and machine learning, arguably topics where ethics is really more relevant than almost anything else in computer science right now. I really can't imagine how one could teach a machine learning class without mentioning things like bias and fairness. But they weren't explicit parts of the class. Now, it's not to say that they weren't taught at all. It's possible, but perhaps weren't considered important enough to be part of the course description. We also took a closer look at AI and machine learning classes, specifically both these technical classes, a deep dive into what they might have mentioned, and standalone AI ethics classes, which also exist. And one of the things that we noticed was that even here, ethics tended to be kind of shunted to the end, if at all. Where this paper got its title from was a syllabus that listed ethics at the very end and just said, well, if time allows, then we'll talk about ethics. And I often hear this from instructors that well, I have so much material to cover in these technical courses, I can't possibly add more content. And I'll talk about that, some strategies for that a little later. We've also been thinking about this for a long time. So actually in the mid 90s, the NSF, National Science Foundation in the US, funded a task force to figure out how to do ethics in computer science education. And they came back and said, we figured it out. The answer is to have a standalone course and to integrate it throughout the entire curriculum. But if you can only do one of those things, then integration is better. And so they suggested another strand through computer science education. And they published an article about this in Communications of the ACM, which is the professional magazine of the ACM. And a computer science professor wrote a letter to the editor that was published in a later issue, complaining about this article and saying that this subject matter is not computer science. You can't, how can a computer scientist teach these things? Discussing the social and ethical impact of computing is not doing computer science. And I think, so I can imagine that some people might disagree with me on this, but I can't see how it would be a bad thing to expand our notion of what computer science is to include discussing the social and ethical impact. And so I want to talk about how integrating ethics across the entire computer science curriculum can help with this sort of cultural attitude towards the role of ethics in computing. So here's my case in 3 bullet points. Integrating ethics throughout the entire curriculum, which means making it part of technical classes. It emphasizes that ethics is part of the technical practice of computing, not a specialization or an add-on. Now, ethics, of course, is also a specialization. I would consider myself a specialist in this area, but as with the safety engineer, it should also be at least a small part of everyone's job. And, siloing it tends to, make people think that it's this kind of PR add-on as opposed to a thing that you do. So like, if you are doing machine learning and part of what you're doing isn't considering the inherent biases in the data, then you are bad at what you are doing, would be my argument. The other benefit of doing this is that it avoids isolating ethics from its context. So, if you spend 3 or 4 years learning how to be a computer scientist, and then at the very end you get like your one ethics lecture or even your one ethics class, and they're like, you know, you should have been thinking about this all along. By that point, it's, you've already learned all of these values that are associated with the work that you're doing, whether it's efficiency or whatever. And you're not thinking about it in the context of the things that you've already been doing. So thinking about them at the same time is really useful. And the other thing, and I would argue that perhaps this is one of the most important, is that this ensures that anyone who takes a technical class is exposed to ethics content. So, not everyone who writes code, works in the tech industry, builds things with technology, et cetera, has a computer science degree. Certainly not. A lot of people are self-taught, or a lot of people take one programming class in college. For my undergraduate degree, and this was 20 years ago, every student at my entire university had to take an intro programming class. And you can do a lot of damage with a little bit of code. And so, if the only exposure to the issues of the power of code and ethical issues and social impacts of code, et cetera, come only in senior level classes, or only in even required electives, that means that not everyone is getting that content. So if I'm going to make this suggestion that this is a good thing to do, I of course want to make some suggestions for how one might do it. So I have some sort of general recommendations, and these come from my own experiences and talking to people and having looked at syllabi for different classes, et cetera. So one point is that you can barely go a day without something relevant about the ethical or social impact of technology in the news. I mean, it's just constant. People sometimes say to me like, oh, my students don't care. And I'm like, really? Like, I mean, whether it's misinformation or content moderation or AI bias or algorithms making decisions, like there's something all the time. We're constantly hearing about it. And if you're in the tech space, you should care about it even more. And so I think even something as simple as discussing current events in order to bring up that like this is a thing that you should be thinking about can actually be really powerful. Another strategy that I've seen is modules that are developed in conjunction with experts. So Harvard University has a program called Embedded Ethics that is based on this idea. So they have philosophy graduate students and postdocs working with computer science professors to create like a module for each computer science class that includes ethics related content, which is also great because a lot of modules like that are then available for other people to use as well. Another strategy is to include ethical components as part of projects or assignments. So for example, if it is a project-based class where say you're creating a prototype of something, including reflection on how this will work out in the world and what the ethical implications, privacy implications, et cetera, of this are as part of the assignment, even if it's a written reflective piece, can be really useful. Another strategy is to use real world data sets that have social implications. So if, for example, you're teaching a data science class, using data sets around things like, say, policing could inherently bring up these kinds of discussions just by virtue of the data that you're using. And these last two are what I'm gonna talk the most about, which are recontextualizing existing assignments to include implicit ethical components, and also starting at the beginning. So the work that I have been doing in this area is funded and supported by this project, the Responsible Computer Science Challenge, where the idea was to give a bunch of people like me at universities some resources in order to integrate ethics into existing classes. And I chose intro programming, the very first place that we see people who are going to learn to code, in part because of that issue of like, what if you only take one coding class? You know, how do you start thinking about these things? And you know, this is not a new idea. Some other examples of this, Evan Peck, who is a professor at Bucknell University, teaches an intro programming class and redesigned it to use a lot of assignments and conversation, discussion, etc., related to ethics, including this assignment, which is based around around self-driving cars and the trolley problem. There's also a project out of MIT where they created AI ethics curriculum for middle schoolers, again, sort of starting at the very beginning. One of the things that I was really concerned about was resources in terms of time and bandwidth on the part of the instructors of these classes. So intro programming classes are often taught very large, often, you know, often by instructors as opposed to, for example, tenure track faculty. And redesigning these classes is huge. There's also very limited resources in terms of grading, et cetera. So, you know, how do you auto grade ethics, for example? I wanted a solution that would be as little work as possible for the instructors. I didn't want to come in and say, okay, hi, I'm going to redesign your class. And now you have to have these 5 new assignments that are about ethics and figure out how to grade them, you know, et cetera. What I did with a team of students and with the help of teaching assistants and instructors in these classes, we took a couple of existing assignments and we created new assignments that taught the same programming content, but were in different contexts. So the first one, which is actually the one at the bottom here, was an assignment about conditionals. And the original assignment was actually like a fortune teller, like, you know, tell me sort of what the lines look like on your hand and all. So we redid that exercise, that instead it was about personalized ads. So this idea that you're writing a program that's going to decide on the ad to serve to someone on a social media platform based on information that they give you. So, you know, it starts out very simple, like if they have a dog, advertise dog food to them. But if they don't have a dog, advertise something else to them. You're very simple, if then. And then you're more multi-way, two-way decisions and multi-way decisions, you know. And there were things like, you know, based on this kind of information, we know that the user is an introvert, and therefore you're going to advertise this thing in this way. And then there was another one that was about zip code and deciding what to advertise to someone based on assumptions about their income, for example. These kinds of things easily teed up conversations around social media privacy and inference, the way that they might know things about you from your data that you don't know that they know, behavioral modeling with machine learning, and Cambridge Analytica, which people are still interested in because they heard a lot about it, right? The other assignment that we did was about college admissions algorithms, and it taught students, you know, the programming concepts were how to iterate through a list. They had a list of data, you know, from prospective students. They had to, you know, do mathematical transformations on the things in this list, pick out people who an algorithm would decide to let into college. And then they had to go through and look for certain kinds of outliers and think about the false positives in this data, the false negatives, the kind of biases that it would have. And students found this very engaging because most of them were college freshmen. And so this was very close on their minds. And we had really engaging discussions about it. And we have a paper about this coming out at 60. And we did some basic survey work with the students, and in general, they were quite positive towards these assignments as compared to the other assignments that they had. So, for example, there was a lot of appreciation for the real world contextualization of this, the familiar topics. It was very engaging. This expanded the students' ideas of what they considered relevant to programming, and a lot of students said that it was more interesting, particularly some students had actually taken other intro programming classes before and said that these, this was more engaging. And there, we asked them about the kinds of things they learned in the class, and there definitely were ethical concepts as learning outcomes. Of course, this also came with some challenges. So one was that there was some lower engagement with this context when students were really struggling with the technical material. For example, so we actually use these assignments in a class for computer science majors as well as one for non-majors. And the students who were non-majors did tend to struggle with material more and reported sort of being less engaged with the ethical content, in part because they were so concerned with trying to understand the technical content. And so this gave us some ideas about the kinds of assignments to incorporate these into, ways to kind of scaffold the technical learning, and also to pull these concepts apart so that maybe they didn't have to be thinking as much about it while they were trying to figure out the code, and instead it maybe came before or after. This also requires some training for instructors and TAs to, for example, lead class discussions, or bringing in guest lectures or guest instructors. We did a little bit of both of these. Though after sort of doing, after going through this once, we found especially that the teaching assistants were quite comfortable in leading discussions on these topics. And of course, a huge issue here is that it is quite challenging to evaluate learning, particularly for large classes that rely on auto grading. So we actually did not do evaluation in terms of grading of their ethical learning. It was just part of the class and embedded into the conversations and the assignments, but we didn't evaluate it in any way. And the instructors did have some concerns that, what if students don't think it's important if it's not on the test? And that is a legitimate concern. We have some ideas for things that we might do here. For example, interview grading, or peer grading or peer review, or even written reflections that are pass-fail, whether you did it or not, in order to encourage more direct engagement without it being a heavy grading load. And so these are a lot of things that we're thinking about moving forward in terms of how to improve this. Another thing is that, again, this was just intro programming, and really we could bring in sort of any kind of ethical topic. There are, of course, ethical topics that are most relevant for certain kinds of computing classes. One of the things that I've been thinking about are the kinds of things that are taught generally and how we might embed them into other classes. So a couple of years ago, I crowdsourced a collection of syllabi from tech ethics classes. This is still online. You can still add to it. It has about 250 or so classes on it. These are mostly standalone tech ethics classes, some taught in computer science departments, some in other places. Also, my students and I did an analysis of the syllabi in these classes to see the kinds of things that were being taught. And these are in general some of the topics that are quite common. So, for example, privacy and surveillance, justice and inequality, algorithms, societal and environmental impact, civic responsibility, professional ethics, etc. And one of the things that we got out of this analysis was that some of these things could certainly be embedded as well into other kinds of classes, as opposed to having to be taught kind of separate from their context. So finally, I wanted to talk about a couple of specific things that I do when I teach standalone ethics class. So I teach a technology, ethics, and policy class. Some things that I do that I think could easily be done in other kinds of classes as well. So one I already mentioned, which is discussion of current events. One of the assignments that I do in my ethics class is that I have students give me an article every week, a news article that is relevant to the class. This is not, it's a pass-fail assignment. It is not difficult. I'm guessing that most students do it in the 5 minutes before it's due by going to Google News and typing in algorithm or AI or privacy or whatever keyword they think of. And so, again, it's a pass-fail thing. It's an ethics class, so I tend to talk about them at the beginning of every class. You could certainly take, say, 5 minutes at the beginning of any class to talk about something that's in the news. But the other thing that this does is that it gets students in the habit of spotting these issues. So, again, to go back to my construction site metaphor, one of the issues is that you need to know what the live wire looks like, right? Like you need to know how, what these kinds of things look like in the wild. And so even something like getting students used to spotting issues in the news, I actually think is a really valuable skill. And then another exercise that I do actually relates again to this idea of ethical debt, which is in part about speculation. It's in part about how do we think about the societal and ethical implications now during the design process, as opposed to, once they've already happened and once it's too late. So some of the work that, some research that I'm spinning up right now is about how we can scaffold creative speculation about ethics into the design process. And this is something that I'm going to be doing in computer science classrooms for project-based classes and this kind of thing. But a sort of lighter weight version of this that I've been doing for a while and have also shared materials about. And so I've heard about lots of people doing it in lots of different kinds of classes. So not just ethics classes, but also technical classes like data science classes, information visualization, etc. And this starts with a cultural touch point that not everyone might be familiar with, but it doesn't require the students to be familiar with, which is the television anthology Black Mirror. So if you're not familiar with Black Mirror, it's a little bit like the Twilight Zone. It's an anthology where every episode is very different. They don't tie together at all. They're like mini movies. And the vast majority of episodes kind of interrogate future harms of technology. The majority of them are quite negative in terms of bad things happening because of technology. So for example, this episode, Nosedive, is about a future in which a sort of social platform that's kind of looks kind of like Instagram, but where people are constantly rating each other. And that builds into a sort of social score for yourself that impacts everything from whether you can rent an apartment to whether you keep your job to whether you can get on a plane, and has this huge influence. And the protagonist is obsessed with getting her score up for various reasons. And of course, it goes very badly for her. And this is an episode that drew a lot of attention, in part because it made people think about things that are happening now. So of course, there are currently concerns around things like citizen scoring, particularly by AI, social credit systems, mass surveillance, and the sort of general social media anxiety, like the need to look good all the time. So I've been doing a teaching exercise I call the Black Mirror Writer's Room, where I have students think about a current technology or a current issue that's concerning them. Is it self-driving cars? Is it surveillance? Is it, is online dating, all, whatever it is that they find interesting, and then think about where that technology might be in 5 or 10 years, and what's something that could go wrong, and then writing a Black Mirror episode about it. I've made this slide deck that's available at this URL here that gives these templates so that students can actually like create these. So this isn't a real episode. This is one that I made. They can create these. It's fun. They get to be creative. And if you're doing it in a topic specific class, it can be, think about future uses of data, think about AI, think about, information visualization. You can always tie it to a specific class. And I've heard sort of good outcomes around this kind of thing. And then one of the important things is, though I think, the speculation is really valuable, part of the conversation is also, first, how did we get from here to there? If you're imagining this as the bad future, what happened so that we got there? And what are ways that we could not get there? Is it the way that the technology was designed? Is it the way that it's used? Can we keep it from being used in that way? Do there need to be, sometimes we go to regulation. At some point, was there someone who was involved in the design of this technology who should have said this needs to go a different way, for example? But even just in getting students to think about the possible ethical, social implications, I think is really important. One way that I think about this is that if students can get super excited about imagining the ethical consequences of some technology that someone might create in 20 years, they should be able to do the exact same thing with the technology that they might create tomorrow. There's no, this does not take a different skill set. And so that's my hope, is that there can be some kind of translation there. So this all comes back to me, it comes back for me again to this idea about whether discussing the social and ethical impact of computing is doing computer science or not. I recently gave a talk about this in a computer science department, and they asked me what kinds of things I think could happen to change this. What are some things that could happen to help sort of thinking about ethics and doing ethics be more considered to be part of computer science? One thing that I thought of was tech companies should be asking about this in job interviews, because I think that is the ultimate version of something being on the test. I also think that it would be wonderful if computer science departments would hire faculty who specifically work in this area, partly because that provides the right expertise to do this kind of thing, and it normalizes it. But even if those things are infeasible for various reasons, even if creating a new class around ethics is not feasible for various reasons, and I've heard about this at a lot of universities, they're not going to let me teach this class. Taking a class that already exists and adding some content that will engage students with ethics, whether it's changing some assignments like I talked about, whether it's doing some, an activity like the Black Mirror Writers Room, if it's talking about current events, doesn't require any changes to the class. It doesn't require taking out any content. That arguably, in some ways, is better than adding new classes, because it reinforces that this is part of the thing that you are learning to do in this class. It is part of you learning to be a computer scientist, is thinking about ethics. All right, so I will end with my usual acknowledgement to my amazing graduate students who helped me do this work, as well as funders, and in particular the Responsible Computer Science Challenge. And I would love to take this remaining time to answer any questions and talk to you all. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Casey. It was really, really lovely, and we've had loads of questions. So
wonderful.
what I'll do is I'll try and collate some of them. So our first question is from Mrityunjay. He asked a two-part question. I think one part you did answer already in terms of what goes into an ethics curriculum and some challenges around squeezing this into the curriculum. But the other part of his question is, who teaches it? Because you did speak about, getting various kinds of experts involved in the design. You also have thoughts on who teaches it, and sort of follow up from my side on that is, what are the implications of this in terms of faculty training? Because I'm sure this is true in all countries at this stage, right? Where faculty themselves are not geared up for this kind of thinking, because in the graduate programs you don't get this exposure typically. So who teaches it and the implications?
Yeah, so that is a great question. So obviously, I think it's wonderful to have ethics experts who can teach classes or can help people create modules, etc. That's obviously not always feasible. Some of these things are, I think, doable by anyone. So, for example, the intro programming exercises that we have, we're in the process of getting them online, which will include. So, I mean, and right now I could. If you want to email me, I can send you the assignment itself already. So those are done. But we're working on getting up resources, maybe some videos of me introducing some things in addition to some readings and slide decks, and like trying to make it as easy as possible to teach this material. And also something like I mentioned, Evan Peck's exercises that are already online. It comes with a great deal of context, etc. Or something like keeping an eye on current events doesn't necessarily require expertise. Again, I think that part of this, it's like, one of the things I always say is that it's not that I want students to know Kant's categorical imperatives, something like ethicsy. I just want them to be thinking about it. There aren't right or wrong answers in ethics. And so it's not like you have to be worried about messing up, like you're going to teach them the wrong thing. And so I think between, finding resources from other people, if there's some opportunity for interdisciplinary collaboration, that's great. But even just starting with hey, I read this thing in the news. Because you probably know more than the students, and there's not a lot sort of wrong that you can teach them in this context.
Sure, and just sort of related to that assessment piece, and you did again touch on this, and I really like the way you sort of connected it to say job interviews and well, so related to that, in this designing of the curriculum and what goes in and what the focus should be, do you see a role for industry in shaping that, and even perhaps some of the assessments? I mean, since you mentioned that it is such an important driver in terms of what actually students pay
attention. I really would like to see a larger role from industry here, as I said. This is something that I've been thinking a lot about lately in the context of my other work in terms of ethical incentives for companies. It's a little difficult to know sort of well, what would their incentive be to ask about ethics in job interviews? But another part of it is, I would also like to see the people who are interviewing ask questions of the people at the tech companies about ethics. Because cynically, if it's not for the sake of doing good, I think there are two major things that make tech companies want to care about this. And one is PR, and the second is losing talent. And there's already been news articles, et cetera, about how college graduates are not wanting to work at certain tech companies because they perceive them as unethical. And so I do think that there's a little bit of an incentive here for companies to work more closely on this kind of thing. And there are some that I think are moving in this direction, which is good.
But amongst those, I mean, you mentioned those two, but you didn't mention the economic driver. I mean, when you use the term ethical debt, I think that's what you were sort of hinting at, in the sense that, okay, I mean, it's not just something that you pass on, but at some point, you know, this might become actually an economic driver as well. I mean, the decision making.
Economics, and I mean, I think that PR implicates economics, or even like, okay, so for example, you know, I've been trashing on Zoom a little bit. I actually just found out the other day that they are apparently monitoring Twitter for Zoom links. And when they find Zoom links on Twitter, they have something that's like checking to see what the privacy settings are, and they contact the account holder and say, hey, you have a public Zoom link on Twitter. You should maybe change your privacy settings, which I think is actually a very nice reactive solution. And it's probably somewhat I mean, I'm not sure how they're doing it, but it costs them something to do that. In addition to, you know, there's been, I've seen some economists talking about how like there's been some financial burden on Uber, for example, because a lot of people choose to use Lyft instead of Uber because they perceive Uber as being unethical. An economist could say a lot more, I'm sure, but I think there are some things beyond just out of the goodness of their hearts, but definitely like business incentives are a huge reason why we're seeing ethical problems for sure.
Sure. So I'm going to give now an amalgamation of some questions that a few people have asked. And it's you know, in this kind of a curriculum, and speaking about this, is there a risk that, you know, people are going to sort of debate or what is an ethical person? And you know, I mean, does this course get into things like that? I mean, where do you? There is a distinction between computer ethics and ethical computing, and if so, where is that distinction in terms of, you know, the differences between societies in terms of?
Well, I mean, you know, to get to that last, the very last part of your question, something that's at the root of a lot of this and is very challenging is, of course, like, whose ethics, right? And that is a very difficult question to answer. And, you know, and it's one of the reasons why it's challenging to teach ethics, because, you know, values, for example, can be quite different. And this is one of the reasons why, again, this isn't about teaching right or wrong answers. This is about teaching a way to think, a way to look at a problem. And in fact, when we did that syllabus analysis, we looked at course objectives, and the objectives aren't things like know the right answer or, you know, be able to use utilitarianism correctly. It's like critical thinking, debate, issue spotting, you know, making an argument, those kinds of things. You know, and the other thing is, you know, someone asked me recently, like, well, does taking an ethics class actually make someone a more ethical person? And I don't even think that that's the right answer. You know, I would like to think that the vast majority of students in our computing classes want to do the right thing. They don't want to do the wrong, right? Like, they don't, like, you know, most of them care, like, or at least they don't not care, if that makes sense. The challenge is convincing them that they should be thinking about these things too, and helping them know what kinds of things to look for. Like, there are some people who are, I mean, there's some technologies that should just obviously not exist. And the people who created them are not ethical people. And taking an ethics class is probably not going to make them it's not going to make them care if they don't care. You know what I mean? Like, that's a very different problem. Like, if there's a legitimately bad person, I don't think taking an ethics class is going to fix that. This is about the neutral people and the people who want to do good, but maybe don't know what to look for, etc. And so I think that's something that we can really help people with. And again, part of it is seeing a problem or knowing that there might be a problem, and then seeking out the expertise if you need it. And so it's not about like defining what is ethical. It's about like thinking through these problems. which, again, it is challenging to teach, but in some ways, at least you don't have to know the right answers in order to teach it.
Right. I'm actually going to allow Lakshmi to speak because she's asked several interesting questions that go off in a couple of different directions. So Lakshmi, over to you.
Thank you, Professor Viraj. Thank you, Casey, for all your. I've been following you on Twitter, and thank you for all your TikToks and on the PhD student one, which we have really shared in our lab, and we enjoyed it. Thank you for that. So my question starts with, in a software design class. Okay, is it a good idea to start with? Is a software really necessary? Because what the learners seem to take away is that most CS major students seem to take away is that apping, creating an app or creating a software is a solution to any problem. So a lot of ethical concepts can be dealt with in that way. And the other thing that in the tertiary education, I've been having this question is that in K-12, which are the formative years, ethics integrated into the curriculum seems to be a good idea. But we have learners in the CS majors, we have learners who already come in with a belief system which is formed and they are kind of a little strong. So how do you think that, we could approach teaching ethics?
Yeah, so those were both great questions. Let me start with the second one, because I think it's a little easier, and that my answer is like, yes, I would love to do this in K-12. So I mentioned, that one project out of MIT, and then one of the reasons that I decided to start with intro programming actually was because I think that it can be easily translated to K-12, and so I'm hoping to work with some people on that. And then, the first issue that you brought up, like, technological solutionism, I think it's huge, right? And this is something that I talk about a lot. Let me give you a concrete example of something that I talked about in my class recently as this is my ethics class, we did a week on design ethics. A couple of years ago, someone wrote an essay that was kind of a thought experiment about how we might fix US prisons. And they saw the problem of prison being violence and cost. And so their solution was, let's put all of the prisoners, put them into isolation and give them VR headsets and Soylent, so that like they don't interact with each other, and this would be so much cheaper. But look, they're in VR, so they're going to get, et cetera. Even Zuckerman wrote a great op-ed in the Atlantic in response to this, and was bringing up how, like, so the problem with prison is like violence and overcrowding, and we're going to solve it with technology. When like you shouldn't be, like, the problem is there shouldn't be this many people in prison. And so you're not solving the right problem. And there are, I think a lot of other issues like this, like, the other example I use a lot is, especially like 5 years ago, when we first started talking about misinformation and fake news, like everyone just immediately jumped to Facebook needs to fix it. Twitter needs, like Google needs to fix it. Like that's the problem, is the algorithm. And like, sure, okay, you can put a technological band-aid on something. Like you can, Google can tweak its algorithm so that they put the crazy conspiracy theory on like page 5 of the search results. But someone who believes in that conspiracy theory is still going to click through to 5 pages to find the thing they want. Like the problem is, why are people creating this? Why are people believing it? Why are they sharing it? But that is a much harder problem to solve than let's tweak an algorithm. So I think that that's absolutely part of the discussion that one should be having is, are you solving the right problem? And is technology even the solution to this at all? And we definitely should not be starting from the assumption that technology is the right solution. So I think that's a great conversation to be having with students.
Thanks for that. And so there were a few more questions, which I think we're going to have to skip because we are running a little bit over time. It's our fault. We started a little late. Casey, you did mention that you are putting out some resources out there, and for those of us who would like to sort of build on that. One of the themes of this particular Compute conference this year is we are trying to instigate some of these multi-institutional studies, because we have so much diversity in our own country. And so certainly on this piece, at least exploring how we integrate this into the curriculum, into CS1, trying to actually try and take a stab at that assessment piece that you mentioned, where there are a lot of questions. I think there would be a lot of interest. So certainly I would be very interested, but I'm sure many others would be. Just wanted to check with you. I don't mean to put you on the spot here, but if there is interest in this, in getting a group of us interested in collaborating with you and others on doing this kind of study, would you be interested, and how would we try and work together?
Yeah, I would love to talk more about that. Like I said, one of the things that I'm really trying to do is like build out resources for other people to use. And one of the things I was hoping was like, and then find out how it goes. So yeah, I would love to. So please feel free to reach out. The other thing I'll mention is that, I had my Twitter handle on my slides. So a couple of hours ago, I tweeted links to some of the papers and stuff that I just mentioned, so that they'll be easy to find. But I'm happy to follow up with some people.
Many thanks so much. Really, we've kept you up very late. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're very welcome. It is now past my bedtime.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Take care, and over to Nagpur for the rest. Thank you.